Okay, colleague, I think we can start. Good afternoon to everybody, and thanks for being here, for those who are present. It's an important date, the one we are recalling, even if it is tomorrow, 10 years after Brexit. Still a polarizing debate. I had the chance also on your behalf to meet British citizens that worked for 330 kilometers from London, from Westminster, the Parliament Square, to Place de Luxembourg. And they walked to express their regret about the decision taken democratically 10 years ago. And they also gave me, as a symbolic gesture, this book, Voices Across the Channel, where there are heartfelt messages of their European commitment as European citizens, not EU citizens anymore for the time being, let's see, in the future. So to tell you that, I mean, our our activities are very much followed outside there, and they asked me to meet them as I have the honor to be the chair of the delegation to the EU-UK Partnership Parliamentary Assembly. Today, I mean, I don't have to recall the news. It's particularly interesting today to listen to our expert about the EU-UK relationship. I think after the decision of Keir Starmer to resign, to discuss about the impact of the referendum 10 years on and the current state and possible future state of the EU-UK relationship. We have two experts. Meg Russell, Professor of British and Comparative Politics, Department of Political Science at the University College of London, and Kieran Pedri, Research Director, Public Affairs, Ipsos UK. They are online, and the Secretariat confirmed me that everything is fine, so a big welcome and many thanks to them. Before starting, I would like to make some technical announcement. The meeting is being recorded, of course, and web streamed. We have interpretation in English and French. Before proceed to our main business today, we have to adopt the agenda. It has been circulated. Any comments? No comments, so the agenda is adopted. The minutes of the last meeting of 23rd of April were circulated as well. Any comment on the minutes? No, so the minutes also are approved. Now I would like to enter into the main point of our meeting, exchange of views on Brexit 10 years on since the referendum. And I would like to start with Mr. Pedri for our today's exchange. So, Mr. Pedri, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a very hot day in London, and yet another Prime Minister has resigned. I joined Ipsos in 2019. I'm about to experience my sixth, which I think is more usual in some European countries than others, but we're certainly getting used to that pace of change. I should have some slides to share with you. I'm only going to speak for about 10 minutes, or if that. I could speak for a lot longer, of course, with all the different nuances of public opinion. But I think it would be useful maybe to just show you some key aspects of public opinion at the moment. So if you go to the next slide. Just to sum up what I'll be talking about, I'll tell you a little bit about what the British public think about Brexit today. Do they think it was the right or wrong decision? Would they support another referendum on EU membership? How might they vote? But then the second half of my remarks, I'll be speaking a bit about what the priorities are for the British public for the UK-EU relationship moving forward. And I'll touch briefly about some similar polling we've done in France and Germany on similar topics before offering some final thoughts. So in terms of the next slide, so a question that we ask on a recurring basis is whether the British public think that leaving the European Union was the right decision or the wrong decision for the UK. You can see on screen here some recent data to that end. 54% of the British public think it was the wrong decision to leave, and 31% think it was the correct decision. There are some predictable splits by different demographics, though, on this subject. Younger people in Britain are more likely to think it was the wrong decision than older people. But also, we find that 86% of those that voted Remain in the 2016 referendum, and 7 in 10 Labour Party voters, so this is the party that's currently in government in the UK, think it was the wrong decision. However, 7 in 10 Leave voters and 3/4 almost of Reform UK voters, so this is the party led by Nigel Farage, think it was the right decision. And it should be said that even though only 1 in 5 Leave voters think that Brexit has gone well and been a success, we still find that 7 in 10 of those voters think it was the right decision. So old habits die hard. Views are still reasonably entrenched in most quarters. Next slide. On the question of another referendum, we recently asked whether the public would support a referendum on EU membership in the next 5 years. 48% would actually support that proposition, and 27% would oppose. And again, the public are divided in predictable ways. Nearly 3/4 of Remain voters support another referendum. One assumes that's because they think that they would win. And also, similarly, those that support, if we can call them more progressive political parties in the UK, tend to support that too. But on the other hand, only 1 in 4 Leave voters support another referendum, and only around a third of Conservative voters. So again, there are predictable political disagreements on this, even if the balance of opinion is more supportive than opposed. And it's somewhat ironic, I suppose, given that 48% of the public voted to remain in the European Union in 2016. It's 48% that support another vote. You do have a large body of opinion there that is neither supportive nor in opposition, which is kind of neutral on the subject, which shows that public opinion can be volatile. Next slide. On the question of membership itself, one of the questions that we've asked recently is whether the public would vote to join the European Union or would vote to remain outside it. And on face value, what you can see here is that 52% of the public say they would vote to rejoin the European Union, whereas only a third say they would vote to stay out, with the remainder either undecided or saying that they wouldn't vote or they prefer not to say. Now again, similar predictable demographic splits on this, but I think what's important is that this is a hypothetical question about a referendum that isn't currently being proposed or isn't currently happening anytime soon. It is therefore, of course, just hypothetical, but it does give you an idea of where public sentiment is at the moment. So by no means a guarantee that if there was another referendum that Britain would vote to rejoin, but there is significant sentiment in that direction, evidenced in this opinion polling by Ipsos. So on the next slide, one of the things that we wanted to do is to dig a bit deeper in terms of what people want from the UK-EU relationship moving forward. I think what's important for policymakers to understand is that, at least in British public opinion terms, it does often depend on how you frame the question. So you can see 2 different pairs of statements here that look at that trade-off. The top pair of statements, we ask people to choose between saying Britain should allow EU citizens to come and live and work in Britain in return for improved access to the single market. 53% chose that statement, over 3 in 10 saying that Britain should stop EU citizens coming to work in Britain with its own immigration rules, even if that means EU restricted access to the EU single market. So when you frame freedom of movement around access to the single market and in economic terms, you can see a majority are supportive of closer relations between the UK and EU, and indeed perhaps even freedom of movement itself. However, when you frame things in a slightly different way around the principles of sovereignty, we find a different answer. So here, 52% say that the government should have total control over who comes to Britain, even if this means a more limited relationship with the EU, compared to 38% that say it's beneficial for Britain to have a closer relationship with the EU, even if that means the government does not have total control over the number of people who come to Britain. Now, this is the joys of public opinion in many ways for people like me that study it. The public are capable of seemingly contradictory opinions at the same time, although it should be said these particular pairs of statements are not necessarily directly in conflict. One talks about EU citizens, one talks about the principle of border control. But I think it shows you that whilst, at least at the surface level, there is strong support for rejoining the European Union, that should be couched in the context that when you start introducing questions about sovereignty, then the picture becomes more murky, and some of those arguments still ring true for many people. Next slide, please. So there's a series of builds on this slide, so whoever's controlling it, if you can just click through just till the whole slide is shown, so that's fine. So what's interesting for the future relationship, though, there's increasingly a sentiment in Britain that the UK's interests are more aligned with the EU and less aligned with the US, for reasons that we may be familiar with and could discuss separately. So in June 2022, just 29% thought that UK-EU relations were interests were completely or mostly the same. That figure's increased to 43%. Whereas in the case of the US, in May 2023, 15% thought that UK-US interests were completely or mostly at odds, whereas today that figure is 45%. So not time to get into the reasons for that here, but a real sense of moving towards Europe and away from America in terms of interests. Next slide, please. And if we can build these slides too, what we've got is a series of, we ask in the UK or in GB, France and Germany, what the most important aspects of the UK-EU relationship are. And you can see the top 5 in each place here. What's striking is that in each of Britain, France and Germany, improving the trading agreement is seen as a key area of cooperation that's important. In Britain, reducing illegal immigration into Britain is seen as the second most important. But if you look across the top 5 issues in the UK, France and Germany, you can see there's lots of alignment around preventing crime and terror, maintaining, creating and improving military alliances. There's also, in France and Germany, managing the refugee crisis is seen as important too. So when we ask the public in each of these 3 countries what the most important aspects of the UK-EU relationship are, we can see lots of alignment, which may be encouraging for future cooperation. Next slide, please. And if you just build this slide to its conclusion, this is perfect. So we also ask whether interests between the UK and EU are completely or mostly the same in a number of these areas. And you can see that strong agreement in Britain that preventing and detecting crime and terrorism, defence and security policy, conflicts in the Middle East and in Ukraine, there's strong agreement that UK-EU relations or interests are aligned. Where the British public are a bit more sceptical is on managing illegal immigration across the English Channel, and also questions around fishing, where there are more people say that the interests are completely or mostly at odds as opposed to completely or mostly the same. And the next slide, this is the penultimate slide, we can see how this sentiment matches in France and in Germany. And again, in both France and Germany, public opinion is strongly aligned with the idea that UK-EU interests are aligned in security and terrorism and various conflicts that we've mentioned, also around climate change and trade. But on the question of fishing in particular, more scepticism than support in France. And maybe managing illegal immigration across the English channels is seen as a less alignment there. So final slide for me, just to sum up, if we can build these 3 bullets together, what have we learned in his very brief remarks, and I can expand upon any of this and others in our Q&A. But the majority of the British public think Brexit was the wrong decision. There's a desire for a closer relationship, but the detail and how that's framed is very important in how you sell it in an enduring way to the British public. There's optimism that the UK and EU can work together, both in Britain, but also in France and in Germany too, particularly on areas of trade, defence and crime. But of course, we simply can't turn the clock back 10 years. There are barriers that remain. A significant body of Leave voting opinion continues to support Brexit. And there are issues, where there are trickier areas for disagreement, such as around immigration or fishing and so forth. And with that, I think I have about 5 seconds remaining. And so I'll pause there and hand over back to the floor.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to give the floor to Professor Russell. Professor, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you. I look forward to our discussion. As has already been mentioned a couple of times, we've obviously got a bit of a special day here in the UK, although they're becoming more frequent with the resignation of a Prime Minister. It's almost like we're celebrating what happened the day after Brexit a couple of days early, because that's what happened to David Cameron. If anybody wants to talk about what's going on in British politics in that sense, I'm very happy to come back to that in questions, because it may be at the height of some of your minds. Kieran has obviously talked about public opinion. I'm going to try and stay largely away from public opinion and talk more about sort of the impact of Brexit on politics at the elite level and on our political institutions. So first, just a quick recap. You'll be very familiar with this, I'm sure, of what happened this time 10 years ago tomorrow. Our referendum was on the supposedly simple question of whether we want to remain in the EU or leave the EU. That referendum was held essentially to resolve an argument inside the governing Conservative Party, which had been bubbling along for many years. It wasn't a question that a huge number of people in the UK were asking, but the Conservative Party was under pressure from internal dissenters and also from Nigel Farage's party UKIP on the outside, who were pressing on this. So the primary reason that David Cameron held that referendum was to make that discussion stop. He thought that there would be a vote for Remain, and then we could all move on and stop talking about it. As a consequence, there was hardly any preparation for the prospect of a leave vote. There was very little, if any, discussion of what exactly our future relationship with the EU might be if we voted for leave. And famously, David Cameron told civil servants that they shouldn't do any preparatory work as to what would happen if we left. The consequence of that was that because there was the unexpected vote to leave, what to do next was left with government and parliament to resolve, with very little input to date from the public. As I've already referred to, David Cameron resigned as Prime Minister the day after the referendum. Theresa May took over from him. What she took over was a very divided country, very divided parliament, and a very divided Conservative Party. She tried to resolve that, you'll remember, by holding an early general election in 2017, which resulted in a minority government, which made her situation in Parliament even harder. So we spent years in Parliament of very fractious and difficult arguments about how to implement Brexit while the negotiations were going on with our former EU partners. And that resulted in, this is something I've written about a lot, lots of questioning of the fundamentals of our institutions. So questioning about the role of Parliament, whether it should be involved in approving the Article 50 trigger. Latterly, Boris Johnson, once he'd taken over from Theresa May, famously prorogued Parliament so that it couldn't even sit and debate in the run-up to our leave date. The courts, on a couple of occasions, had to step in and resolve these arguments between government and Parliament, so bringing the role of the courts into question. Also, it was very disruptive for our devolution settlement, relationships between London, Scotland, Wales, and particularly Northern Ireland, and even the monarchy's role was brought into question, particularly around the prorogation. And attitudes to those institutions became significantly polarised along Brexit lines. So people who supported Brexit were unhappy with Parliament and the courts, whereas people who were not in favour of Brexit were more supportive of Parliament and the courts. It was a very, very divisive problem. I'm not seeing the timing at the top of my screen. I don't know if anybody else can see it, so I'm at risk of losing track of time because I was rather relying on that popping up. Let me talk about three different things in terms of what we can learn. The questions of, were those problems sort of transient problems? Have they been resolved? Have the kind of problems lasted? And what are some of the longer-term lessons and longer-term effects? The first thing, which is a rather obvious thing to say, I think, is that we learnt through that process, if we didn't already know, that referendums are incredibly divisive. Kieran's spoken about public opinion. He hasn't said a great deal, thank you, about something that's been polled a lot in the UK is the levels of polarisation among the public. And that polarisation affects our political elites as well as the public. The extent to which British people became, in effect, two tribes who disliked each other, who were highly critical of each other. And we could come back to that maybe in questioning. The nature of a referendum is it takes what can be, and was in this case, a very complex issue and boils it down to a simple choice between two outcomes, forcing people to choose which side of that divide they are on. So we have a long time history of Euroscepticism in the UK, but that didn't necessarily mean leaving the EU. People were sceptical of the nature of our relationship, but those people had to decide were they for it or against it in a very kind of simplified way. I think it was interesting that we recently had a TV programme on the BBC looking back at this time 10 years ago, and one of the people who was interviewed was Boris Johnson, who went on to become Prime Minister. Johnson famously was tossing up whether to support Leave or Remain in the referendum, and I don't believe everything that Boris Johnson says. I think that would be unwise, but he was genuinely saying, he was claiming on this programme that he really couldn't decide, but he was forced to decide, he felt, and he became a leading light in the Leave campaign, and from that point on he was part of that tribe and he was against the other tribe. And this was happening to people at the elite level and the public level in the UK. The Conservative Party was particularly divided in the referendum and subsequently after the referendum. So I think we've learnt that referendums can be very problematic, polarising devices that oversimplify things, and particularly complicated, I think, because in this case, the Leave-Remain divide was not exactly aligned with the party divide. So people were forced to find new identities. Both of the main political parties were split, and there was no obvious delivery mechanism for the referendum. You couldn't say, well, the government won the referendum and the government will implement the result, because the government itself was split. And this was clearly a referendum that was very poorly prepared for. There was no real prospectus for Leave, and there was very little sort of proper preparation and proper deliberation about what the outcomes might mean, and sort of educational materials and so on. We all know that referendums can be a sort of rather simplistic mechanism for punishing the politicians in power, and that was clearly part of it. In terms of what we're left with, big impacts, I think, on the party system. So these new dividing lines between Leave and Remain, which didn't align with the parties, meant that the Conservatives in particular struggled, but so did Labour. It effectively changed the Conservative Party to, as Kieran has referred to, being largely a Leave party. A great increase in anti-establishment sentiment, frustrations with the inability to deliver Brexit quickly, and the kind of fragmentation that we saw at that time has remained in British politics since. Those rifts haven't really healed. You'll be familiar, I'm sure, with the Reform Party, which is polling well in the UK at the moment, which was built on UKIP and is led by Nigel Farage. They are polling well. The Green Party is also polling well. We've seen a great fragmentation in our party system, which is putting our electoral system under pressure. So the 2024 general election was famously the most disproportionate ever. Labour won 63% of seats on less than 34% of the vote, and so there's talk now about whether we need to change the electoral system. Traditionally, it's been seen that the kind of first-past-the-post electoral system that we have holds together a two-party system. But once the parties have started to fragment, exactly the opposite can happen, because you can win any individual constituency on a very low proportion of the vote. A great irony, I've always said, is that it was European Parliament elections that taught people to vote for other parties. UKIP fought several elections and did very well in them. And then once people had got in the habit of voting for these minor parties, they haven't actually lost that habit, even though we've left the EU. So kind of our politics is becoming, ironically, more typically European after we've left the EU, and that's causing a lot of difficulty. Another thing, let me finish on, is I've referred to what I call the domestication of populism in the UK. So referendums are a bit of a populist device. We were not free of populism in the UK before the referendum, but our populist sentiment was often directed at Brussels. We were a famously Eurosceptic country, seen as a kind of awkward partner. Our media was very Eurosceptic, and our politicians tended to blame the EU quite a lot and not, sell it in a positive way. once we'd left the EU, that raised the question of where would public anger go? And there was a lot of anger in the UK after the referendum because it was very hard to deliver the result. And that anger, as I've kind of already referred to, was increasingly directed towards our traditional domestic institutions, our parliament, our courts, our political parties. So if anybody thinks that holding a referendum on the EU will quieten down populism, it can do exactly the opposite. It can amplify it. The referendum campaign offered easy answers to people that don't really exist and fueled this anger in established institutions. And that is leading to pressure on checks and balances, which also is something that tends to increase with polarisation and impatience with people wanting quicker action, wanting simple solutions. We're seeing this all over the world in terms of the rise of populism, and it wasn't caused by the referendum, but in the UK it's been very much amplified by it. So perhaps I can see I'm up against time here. Maybe just to end by saying that the fact that we've gone through this incredible churn in prime ministers could be seen as connected to this. People wanting easy, quick answers and being very impatient with the process of politics. So we're going to see a new Prime Minister soon. Let's hope that he can deliver on his quite significant promises and that we don't just keep this cycle going. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. And now the floor is open. I see Barry Andrews, everybody, I think. So okay, so Barry and then everybody.
Okay, thank you, Sandro. On the 10th anniversary of Brexit, I think it's important to repeat that Brexit was and is a con job. The UK has not been as invisible and irrelevant on the European stage as it is now since, in my view, before the Battle of Agincourt. It is never on the agenda of the European Council. Even on the 10-year anniversary, the UK wasn't on the agenda of the European Council. 7 prime ministers in 10 years. This is what taking back control looks like. So let's not forget on this 10-year anniversary what a charlatan Boris Johnson was, who was never hesitate to stoke division in Northern Ireland for his own political ends. We shouldn't forget the arrogance of Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was cast comically as the so-called Brexit Opportunities Minister, or the arch-villain Farage, whose shameless dishonesty will always be his defining characteristic. So the best that the EU can do is to point a pathway to full EU membership and to reward whichever UK politician has the courage to articulate the case for the UK at the heart of the European Union. Someone who faces up to the fact that the UK economy pre-Brexit was 90% the size of the German economy and is now 70% the size of the German economy. Someone who can see that the world of 2016 is over and not returning, and that the anemic reset casts the UK for all time as a rule taker. Ultimately, it would be an enormous boost to the EU if the UK was to even consider rejoining. And my message to officials in the Commission and to certain member states is to not place false obstacles in the way of the UK rejoining. The Commission and those member states need to wake up to the reality of that fact. Finally, my questions to the guests is, do they agree with my view that the UK-EU summit tabled for the 22nd of July should be postponed until September? And do they agree that regardless who the Prime Minister is, the Commission needs to anonymise its relationship with the UK, especially given the fact that the position that Farage enjoys in UK opinion polls? Thank you.
Thank you. Dobre?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, yes, this is a very sad anniversary because you can see what populists can do to a nation. I'm Hungarian. I have seen what 16 years of populism means for Hungary. And it was shocking to see that in the country which was the birthplace of parliamentarism and democracy, something like that could happen and people could be fooled actually by extreme populism about Brexit. Healthcare is not better in the United Kingdom. As we see, even the economic situation is not better. Migration situation is nothing Nothing is better now than it was 10 years ago. And that's why it was very interesting to listen to our experts and see the polls, see the people, see the eye-opening, see that there is an unmet political desire, as I see in the majority of the population, to rejoin EU. Also, I don't like the sentence rejoin, because you can't turn the time back, and EU is not the same as it was in 2016. So United Kingdom has to join the new EU, which is about defence, about military cooperation, about strategic autonomy, which is not simply a simple market or an economic union, but it's more and more a political union. So it's definitely a different process than rejoin or reset. We have to look forward into the future, and it's an absolutely different path. And my question to our expert is, if the polls are correct, and I've seen not only one but several polls in the last few days about people's acceptance and desire to strengthen the connections between EU and UK, and even rejoin, as now they ask it. Why the political elite or the political class remains so in silence in all, even pro-European parties? So how interesting is that people, majority of the people, are out loud, they speak about it openly, and as I see, the political decision-making and political governing class is always a little bit more in silent in these issues, even when we have small talks with our UK friends from all parties, even pro-Europeans. One day they are not brave enough to go with this kind of public opinion. This is very interesting.
Thank you. Barley?
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks to the experts. I have to say, in my memory, it's not 10 years ago. It feels a bit like it was maybe not yesterday, but 10 years, it's such a long time, and I still recall how we were all standing there, holding each other at the hands and singing together all alongside. And I miss the Brits, I have to say. I think they were important for the political culture in this House. I think they really brought a lot of democratic experience and tradition, of wit and capability to negotiate in a very special way. So they are not here anymore, and when I look at the statistics, it's of course good to see that a lot of people realize what a mistake it was, but it's also deeply disturbing because the division was mentioned by Meg, and it was not only a division amongst the elites, it was a division that sometimes ripped families apart. And it was a division that cost lives. Just a few days ago, we also commemorated Jo Cox, who was murdered. I mean, a young mother of two, a Labour colleague of ours, who was murdered by a fanatic Brexiteer just because of her belief that UK would be better off staying in the European Union. I think we also have to think of this when we speak about what populism and this fanatism is capable of, what it can lead to. I have two questions. One is, when we had a look at the first slides, you could see that the group of undecided grew. The very first, I think also the second slide. So, are you for or against a new referendum? Or do you think Brexit was a good or a bad idea? How would you? What kind of interpretation would you give to that? Is it because it is so long ago? People think, let's move on. We have other things to worry about. Is it because this populism has trickled down so much that it is whatever, you know? So this would be my first question, and the second one is related to that. How do you think the perspective now people do want to come back because they still remember how it was to be in the European Union? Do you think that this might, if it doesn't happen soon, that it might sort of fade out and people will lose interest, or will it become more and more urgent? Do you have a perspective, a prognosis there? Lastly, I would like to say, I think when I speak to colleagues here, I think that the British would always be welcome again. It's like Clara said, it would not be a rejoin, it would be a new joining phase. It would be difficult, but I think we should keep our doors and our hearts open.
Thank you. Agada.
Thank you, and I would like to thank the speakers for their presentations. I have a question for each and one of them. So to Mr. Pedley, I'm very interested to hear more about what you were talking about as the public perception with respect to the youth. So the youth, that they are the future demographic of the United Kingdom, why they are more prone to say that they would like, let's call it rejoin. What are the advantages that they actually see in this? What makes them want to be part of the union? And also, that part of the demographic which would not like to see this as an option, what pushes them away from seeking this option? It would be very interesting to see how the demographic will look like in the future. And the question to Professor Russell, it's going to be a very blunt question. How would you envisage the EU and UK relationship to look like under a reform-led government, or a government which would contain reform in it? Because we would like to understand also a little bit better what is the perception of reform of the relationship, how they would lead the country with the relationship with the EU, so that we can also understand better what the polls actually mean for the future of our relationship 10 years after Brexit, but hopefully many more of a close relationship. Thank you.
Ruben Kova.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I will also try to be brief and focus more on the numbers rather than the emotional breakup that we've all been through in 10 years ago. What worries me is, I don't see the polls as that explicit in terms of the change of opinion, and I would like to hear a bit more from our experts, because they've emphasized on that as well. But it's not a dramatic shift. There is a big shift in terms of the alignments of policies and priorities more towards the EU compared to the US. That was very significant. But when it comes to rejoining, to the referendum, I don't see such a massive difference in terms of what we were seeing in May or April of 2016. So my question is, how do you think we can do a bit more work to have a better understanding and not end up in a situation, even if there is another referendum or a proper political discussion, that people don't have the understanding and the knowledge, what are we talking about? Because for me, it doesn't seem so different in terms of the division in the society, what we have now in the pictures that you've presented in terms of stats, to what we had a bit more than 10 years ago. So there must be some more effort, also from the political players, but also from the institutions, from the academia. Where can we be of help for a bit more efficient and tangible collaboration on that matter? Thank you.
Thank you. Please, pero no tenemos la interpretación en español.
I will speak in English.
Muy bien.
Thank you. My questions go to Professor Russell. After 10 years of Brexit referendum, we still struggle with the agreement about Gibraltar. Actually, the text presented has been an agreement between the European Union and the United Kingdom on Gibraltar, where Spain even had not a voice. This agreement is likely to have significant economic, political and territorial consequences, especially for us, for Spain, and for the citizens of the Gibraltar area. However, we are setting that its provisional application is being considered before the European Parliament has completed its review, and without the Spanish Parliament having held a meaningful debate on its implications. For the perspective of democratic legitimacy and parliamentary oversight, Do you consider it appropriate for international agreement of this significance to be taken effect before parliaments have been able to fully exercise their oversight role? Isn't the risk that parliamentary approval will end up becoming a mere formality once the agreement is already in effect and has created a fait comply? We have news already that how the border have been already, there are works already in the borders. So we see that really will be applied before healing a debate here in the Parliament and be voted.
Thank you. Before giving back the floor to our expert, we still have 13 minutes. I would like to add also a couple of questions on my side. First one, very personal, very political. What is your judgment about the shyness with which the general mainstream political parties have treated the very negative consequences of Brexit concerning Nigel Farage? I think that the populists should pay the bill for their lies. And Nigel Farage obviously lied, in my view, and this is my personal view, to the British people. He promised less illegal migration. There is more. Boris Johnson promised £350 million per week to the NHS. This pound didn't come, so there were a lot of lies. So my question, and I repeat as Sandro Gotti, member of Renew, is how come that we don't make the political mainstream party didn't make to pay the bill to those who are still in politics? Boris Johnson is gone. I really need to understand what is the dynamics beyond the partisan approach, the dynamics of the British debate which prevent from saying the truth. Why? Because there are constituencies on which the Brexiters voters are still very determinant and decisive to win the seat for the Labour, for the Tories, for other reasons. In general, I think that the Brexit is a consequence also of a very sick approach of both the media and the British political elite to the issue of being a member of UK, because if you do Euro bashing from Monday to Sunday, like the tabloid have done for many years, and then all of a sudden on a Sunday, David Cameron decided to let the British decide in a democratic way whether they want to leave or remain, they decide to leave. Because they've been told for 30 years that the EU was the origin of all the problem of UK, and that UK would be much better off without EU. So, I mean, do you think that the lesson has been learned or not? And the second point, I see that basically the fundamental issues around which also the Brexit was organized, apart the lies on AHS, remain, because even those who want to rejoin, they want to foster the relationship with the EU, but there is still concern about migration. That means free movement. That means a major obstacle to rejoin the single market. On fishing rights, that means fishery policy. Freedom of movement. Do you think that these divergences between, legitimate divergences between the British public opinion and the EU are there to stay, and that could be a major obstacle the day where the UK decided to foster the partnership or even to open the debate on a new membership? Thank you very much. And I will start again with Mr. Pedley and then Professor Russell. You got 5 minutes each to answer to our question. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those questions. There's sort of 4 that stood out to me. One was around, a recurring theme was this question about immigration. Where does the UK and EU need to cooperate more or work together? There's why don't mainstream political parties make the argument more forcefully? And then there was a specific question on young voters and young people, which I might sort of finish with. I think on migration, this remains a key barrier, as was alluded to by several speakers, to closer cooperation and indeed rejoining. In my remarks, I showed that a majority of the public still find the arguments, at least around what's called total control over borders, to be persuasive. I think when we ask the public about, in more detail, about their perceptions around immigration, there tends to be legal and illegal migration tend to get conflated. So to maybe talk about immigration alongside one of the areas of cooperation, I think that one area that might soothe some of the concerns in some areas of British public opinion is this question of illegal immigration and channel crossings with small boats. It's a very emotive topic. It creates a lot of reaction particularly amongst conservative opinion, small c, I should say, conservative opinion in the UK. I think if there was meaningful progress on that, perhaps that falls down, or more so, perhaps that falls down the political agenda. But the question of freedom of movement is always going to be a particularly challenging one. I think that there it really becomes about the benefits of the single market outweighing the perceived negatives, where there are perceived negatives around freedom of movement. So I think that to a large extent British public opinion needs to be sold the idea that single market access and membership will make living standards better in the UK. And I think, why don't mainstream parties make some of these arguments? Well, I think it's fundamentally because a lot, particularly on the left, they feel burned by making them before. So in 2019, Boris Johnson won re-election on the basis of Get Brexit Done. The Labour Party at the time had a manifesto commitment to another referendum, and the perception was that that was a mistake. And so I think that lots of politicians on the more progressive end, whilst they are very sympathetic to rejoining the European Union full stop, they are nervous about what the political implications of pursuing such a policy might be. But I think I've talked a lot about immigration because we can't ignore it it's the number one issue on the minds of the public. When we ask what are the most important issues facing Britain today, immigration and asylum is number one, and has been, apart from 1 month, a couple of months ago when it was the economy. This has been consistently the number one issue for the last couple of years. It hasn't gone away, so we can't ignore it. But in the most recent local elections that we had in England, the cost of living was the number one issue. So I think it's about politicians, particularly in the UK, making the argument that membership of the European Union has meaningful economic benefits. But just to sort of finish the last minute or so, just talking about young people, there is also a values argument as well. Younger people tend to support EU membership that more so than older people. That was true in 2016 and it's truer today. And part of the reason why we see majorities for rejoin today is simply, to put it crudely, because lots of Leave voters have died since the referendum in 2016 and they're being replaced, if you like, in the electorate by younger voters that have more sort of pro-European values. Part of that is because younger voters don't care about immigration as much. They care more about jobs and the cost of living and the environment and things of that nature. But also they see much more common values with Europe than maybe older cohorts too. And of course, none of these things are monolithic and universal. There are older voters that passionately support EU membership too. But that tends to be kind of where the pattern is. So I think that to try and sort of tie it all together, how would I sum things up? The issues of immigration and asylum haven't gone away, and this idea of border control, which is why in any future referendum debate, if there is ever to be one, that it's going to remain a significant barrier. That's very, very important. But I think ultimately what people like me will always say is that public opinion can be led as well as followed. And so if rejoining is ever going to be a meaningful prospect, it needs politicians, most likely in the Labour Party on the progressive end, but who knows? It needs politicians to make that case very vociferously and to sell some of the pro-European arguments. That's been quite absent at the moment, but I think there's lots of sentiment that says Brexit was the wrong decision, that there's openness to rejoin in the future, but to make that happen in reality, in tangible terms, requires a fight, because as we see here today, Nigel Farage is still ahead in the polls.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Russell.
So much to get through there. I can't do it all justice. Well done to Kieran for covering so much. I'm sorry that we can't have a back and forth with Kieran as the public opinion specialist, because I think it's a very interesting question how much we should read into the kind of pro-rejoin sentiment which is showing up in the polls. One of your members referred to the fact that the difference between the two sides is not actually that huge, so don't get too excited about it, and that worries me too. And if you look back to the polls pre-2016, of course, one of the reasons that David Cameron so readily went into that referendum was that they consistently showed that public opinion was pro-EU. So he thought that he could win, and he didn't. So I think that goes back to points that I was making about how referendums can be used. They're a very kind of clunky device which are often used for punishing the political class, punishing the people who are in power. And of course, once people have taken up their positions, and I think I've seen other pollsters talk about this with respect to the EU, opinion becomes very sticky. You've joined a tribe and you're not willingly going to depart that tribe just because everything's not going well. You actually blame the politicians for not delivering Brexit well, rather than saying that Brexit was the problem. So I would not particularly like to predict the outcome of a future referendum. I don't think it's quite as simple as, there's a majority in favour and therefore if we had a referendum tomorrow, it would be pro-rejoin. I think it would depend quite a lot on the circumstances. I think there is a bit of a danger that this has all been about simple solutions to complex problems. If we see rejoin as a simple solution, then that creates dangers of its own. I think EU membership has become kind of symbolic. And the two tribes that have formed, there are academics who have written very convincingly about this. It's not necessarily about EU membership. It's not about the technicalities. It's about belonging. It's about being on a side. The divides are age divides, income divides, education divides, and those can be mobilised for different solutions, different kind of policy solutions in the future. So I think what we've seen is a move in the UK, and I think we're seeing this in many, many places around the world, very sadly, from kind of complex politics to simplistic politics. Politics is complex. It's there to resolve complex problems. And I think that the Brexit referendum allowed in a new kind of irresponsible politics where people make promises that they can't keep, pretend that everything is easy, and then when those things are not delivered, it simply makes people more angry with politicians. So I think there's something very, very big that we need to resolve there, not just in the UK, but around Europe and around the rest of the world as well. Somebody asked about if there was a reform government. I'm sure they would want to decouple further from the EU, although they might find it difficult because, of course, we have become, in many ways, a rule taker rather than a rule maker. We're still governed by much of the same regulation as we had before. We just don't have a seat around the table. And what I learned during this process is you really can't decouple yourself from globalisation. This was an anti-globalisation vote. We can't become just an island which doesn't trade with other countries around the world, be it in the EU or further afield. But what reform is doing is moving on. Rather than saying, oh, OK, you can't decouple yourself from the rest of the world, it's looking at the next frontier of what we can decouple ourselves from and moving on to talk about the European Convention on Human Rights in particular. So that would be part of their agenda. In terms of, I do agree with some of the comments of the chair and some of his perplexity as to why we don't talk about some things more. I think the simple truth is that Brexit, the post-referendum, was very, very painful and difficult for people. And it was divisive in the parties and the public was divided. And so the politicians wanted to stay away from it. They wanted to stop talking about it. They wanted to avoid the questions. They are frightened of a polarised public. They are frightened of populism and people blaming the political class for things, and they don't want to get on the wrong side of the public as elected politicians. Maybe I could end on Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer came into government with a rather kind of difficult message about how politics is hard, things are complicated, expensive, they take time, there aren't simple answers. And Keir Starmer, having won a landslide in 2024, has just resigned as Prime Minister today. It's not just because of that happened. I think he had some weaknesses as a politician, but telling people that the world is complicated and politics doesn't have all the answers very easily is quite a challenging and kind of potentially frightening thing for politicians to do, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Thank you very much to you both. The hearing is over. Just to inform you, as you know, that the EU-UK summit had been announced for the 22nd of July. Now, in these very hours, it is questioned whether the day should be kept or not. At the earliest, we could know the name of the new UK Prime Minister on the 16th of July, at the latest in September. So we don't know whether this very important second summit will be confirmed or postponed. The meeting is over. You will receive through the usual means the date and the items of the next meeting. Thank you very much.